The wind cutting through the canyon did not howl. It moaned a low, relentless sound that carried the bitter chill of the coming winter. The arroyo, dry only hours before, had become a violent churn of muddy water and splintered wood. What was left of the wagon lay scattered like broken ribs against the rocks. Evelyn knelt in the damp red earth. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron and an unnatural ringing silence. She was shivering a deep, violent tremor that rattled her jaw and turned her hands numb. Her dress, a heavy creation of layered wool and watered silk, was supposed to be a shield against the frontier. Now soaked through with icy river water, it was a sodden anchor dragging her body temperature down into the dangerous, lethargic territory of the long sleep. The fabric clung to her like a second freezing skin. She did not hear him approach. The desert had a way of swallowing sound when it chose to. There was only the sudden sharp scent of wet sage and the quiet snort of a horse. Evelyn lifted her head, her lashes heavy with freezing droplets. He sat atop a dun gelding, a dark silhouette against the bleak gray horizon, an Apache. His face was a study in hard angles and weathered bronze framed by hair the color of midnight. He wore knee-high moccasins and a heavy wool blanket draped over broad shoulders, shedding the cold like water off a duck's back. He did not draw a weapon. He simply watched her. His eyes black and unreadable as obsidian took in the wreckage, the dead oxen, the shattered wheels, and finally the woman trembling in the mud. There was no pity in his gaze. Pity was a useless thing out here. There was only calculation. He was measuring how long she had left before the cold stopped her heart. He slid from the horse with a liquid grace that belied the harsh terrain. His boots made no sound on the wet earth. He approached her, his steps deliberate, and dropped a tightly rolled bundle of thick tanned hide upon the ground between them. Evelyn pulled her arms tightly across her chest, her teeth chattering so violently she tasted blood where she had bitten her own lip. She expected hostility. She expected capture. What he offered instead was a command delivered in a voice like stone grinding against stone. English heavily accented, but brutally clear. "Take off the dress." Evelyn recoiled, her breath catching in a ragged gasp. Even here at the edge of the world, with her life draining away into the mud, the ingrained modesty of her upbringing flared to life. She clutched the sodden collar of her gown, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. She shook her head, a frail, trembling refusal. The man closed the distance between them. He did not touch her, but his presence was a heavy, immovable weight. He looked at the blue tint of her lips, the white, bloodless grip of her hands on the soaked silk. "You are freezing," he said, the words flat and devoid of emotion. "That cloth is ice. It will kill you before the moon rises." "I cannot," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the wind. "I am a lady." He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The smell of wood smoke and old leather wrapped around her, a sharp contrast to the stench of muddy ruin. His expression remained entirely impassive, a mask of sheer pragmatic survival. "The desert does not care what you are," he told her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing hypnotic intensity. He gestured to the heavy hide bundle on the ground. "Take off the dress. Put that on." When she still hesitated, paralyzed by the chilling wind and the ghosts of a society that no longer existed out here, his jaw tightened. He did not soften his tone. He did not offer sweet assurances. He offered only the brutal, honest truth of the frontier. "Take off the dress," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, commanding timbre. "This isn't about love. It is about breathing tomorrow." The wind whipped around them, scattering the last of the rain. In his dark eyes, Evelyn saw no trace of the predatory men she had been warned about. She saw only the reflection of a harsh, unforgiving world, and the single narrow path to surviving it. The heavy soaked wool felt like lead against her chest. Slowly, with fingers that could barely bend, she reached for the first button at her throat. The air bit at her skin the moment the soaked wool fell away. It was a vicious, teeth-chattering cold that seemed to sink straight into the marrow of her bones. Evelyn worked with clumsy wooden fingers, peeling the layers of her former life down into the mud. The corsets, the petticoats, the silk, all of it transformed from a symbol of Eastern refinement into a sodden pile of useless rags. She stood trembling in the fading light, her breath pluming in white clouds. The Apache had turned his back. He stood a dozen paces away, facing the ridge, a silent sentinel against the gathering dark. It was a small, unspoken mercy, a sliver of dignity in an entirely undignified moment. Evelyn unrolled the bundle he had dropped. It was a dress of thick tan buckskin. It smelled fiercely of wood smoke, animal grease, and earth, a heavy primal scent that filled her nose and lungs. The leather was surprisingly supple, softened by hours of laborious scraping and working. She pulled it over her head. It was meant for a woman broader than she was, hanging loosely over her slight frame. But the moment it settled against her skin, the difference was immediate. The thick hide blocked the biting wind. It held no moisture. It was a shelter woven from the wild itself. She wrapped her arms around her torso, feeling the desperate heat of her own body, finally being trapped and kept. "I am dressed," she called out. Her voice was thin, raspy from the cold. He turned. He did not look her up and down or assess her appearance. His gaze moved past her, scanning the dying light, the shelter of the canyon walls, and the damp brush. Without a word, he began to gather what dry tinder he could find beneath the overhangs of the red rock. Evelyn watched him work. His movements were a study in absolute efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no frantic scrambling. Every motion was deliberate, born of a lifetime navigating a land that punished mistakes with death. He knelt in the dirt, drawing a piece of flint and a steel striker from a pouch at his belt. He struck the steel. A shower of brilliant orange sparks cascaded onto a bed of shredded bark and dry sage. He leaned close, blowing gently. The rhythm of his breath was steady, coaxing the tiny ember into a fragile flame. The smell of burning sage rose in the air, sharp and clean, cutting through the dampness of the recent storm. He fed the fire slowly, twigs, then branches. Soon a steady crackling blaze pushed the shadows back against the canyon walls. He gestured to the ground near the fire pit. "Sit," he commanded, his tone low and resonant. Evelyn moved toward the heat, sinking onto a flat stone he had rolled near the flames. The warmth washed over her face, thawing the numbness in her cheeks and hands. She watched the firelight dance across the hard planes of his face as he sat across from her. He pulled a battered tin canteen from his saddlebags, uncorked it, and held it out across the flames. She took it, her hands still shaking slightly. The water was lukewarm, tasting metallic, and of the earth. But it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She lowered the canteen, wiping her mouth with the back of her buckskin-clad sleeve. The rough texture against her skin was a grounding reminder of where she was and who she was with. "Thank you," she murmured the words, feeling small in the vastness of the canyon. He did not offer a polite reply. He took the canteen back, taking a small swallow himself. He watched the flames, his profile etched against the dark. "The silk would have frozen to your skin," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving the fire. "By midnight, you would not have felt the cold anymore. You would have just gone to sleep." Evelyn looked at the muddy pile of her discarded clothes, barely visible at the edge of the firelight. The truth of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. His harshness earlier had not been cruelty. It had been a lifeline thrown with the rough urgency of a man who knew exactly what the desert demanded. He had stripped away her vanity to save her life. As the fire snapped and the wind moaned high above the canyon rim, Evelyn realized she did not even know his name. But as she watched him silently tend the embers, a quiet, profound shift occurred within her. She was entirely at his mercy, alone, in the brutal wild. Yet for the first time since the wagon shattered, she felt safe. Dawn broke over the rim of the canyon, not with a gentle rosy glow, but with a sudden blinding violence. The light bleached the red rock to the color of old bone. Evelyn woke with a heavy stiffness in her joints, her muscles screaming in protest at the hard earth. The fire had burned down to a mound of fine white ash, a thin ribbon of smoke still spiraling into the still morning air. The Apache was already moving. He was a shadow detaching himself from the deeper shadows of the rock wall. The dun gelding was saddled, the meager supplies secured tightly against the harsh journey ahead. He did not offer a morning greeting. The frontier had no use for pleasantries. Instead, he walked over and dropped a strip of dried, dark meat into her lap. It was tough as leather, tasting fiercely of salt and smoke, but as she chewed, she felt the raw energy of it seep into her exhausted body. They climbed out of the sheltered arroyo and onto the high desert floor. Here the world opened up into a vast, terrifying ocean of pale green, sage-brittle scrub brush and cracked yellow earth. The wind was entirely different from the moaning draft of the canyon. It was a relentless dry force that scoured the skin, carrying grit that stung her cheeks and parched the back of her throat. He walked ahead, leading the gelding by a simple leather rein. He did not offer her a place on the horse's back. Whether the animal was already burdened with vital supplies, or whether he knew her freezing blood needed the heavy circulation of walking to fully thaw, she did not ask. She simply followed. The buckskin dress moved with her heavy, but forgiving. The thick hide moccasins he had provided forced her to abandon the stiff heel-striking walk of city pavements. She had to learn a new rhythm, a sliding, careful step feeling the contour of the uneven ground through the soft leather soles. The sun climbed higher, a burning copper coin in a vast cloudless sky. The freezing morning dissolved into a blistering, oppressive noon. The heavy buckskin, a savior in the freezing dark, now trapped the fierce heat of the day. Sweat pooled at the nape of her neck, trickling slowly down her spine. Fine, pale dust coated her eyelashes and settled bitter and metallic on her tongue. She focused all her remaining will on the man walking ahead of her. She watched the broad set of his shoulders under the wool blanket, the steady rhythmic sway of his stride. It was a hypnotic pendulum. Left, right, left, right. He moved through the punishing landscape like water flowing over stones, entirely frictionless, while every step for Evelyn felt like dragging iron chains. Her foot caught the edge of a half-buried root. She stumbled her breath, catching in a dry, painful rasp, her hands throwing out to catch herself before her knees hit the baked earth. She recovered, biting the inside of her cheek. She would not call out. She would not ask him to halt. She knew instinctively that to be a burden out here was to court death. He did not turn around. He did not look back to check on her. But as she righted herself and pushed forward, she noticed a subtle shift in the distance between them. The rhythm of his walk had changed. The long ground-eating strides shortened by a fraction. The pace slowed just enough. He was calibrating his movement to her exhaustion. It was a silent concession, a quiet act of grace hidden beneath a stoic exterior. By mid-afternoon, the silence between them was as heavy and absolute as the heat. It was not a tense or angry silence, but the deep shared focus of simple survival. When the shadows finally began to lengthen, painting long bruised streaks of purple across the sagebrush, he halted the gelding near the meager shade of a twisted juniper tree. He reached into the weathered saddlebag and pulled out the tin canteen. He turned to face her for the first time in hours. Evelyn's face was flushed dark red, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her lips cracked and coated in white dust. He pulled the cork. The faint smell of the water hit her senses, like a physical blow making her throat ache with sudden desperate want. He was covered in the same dust, breathing the same scorching air, yet he did not drink. He held the canteen out to her. His eyes met hers, dark, steady, and entirely unwavering. In that simple, profound gesture, offering her the first precious draw of water, he spoke volumes that English words could never carry. It was not a grand declaration. It was the solemn promise of shared survival. Evelyn took the heavy tin, their dust-covered fingers brushing for a fraction of a second, the cool metal, a stark contrast to the burning world around them. The sky did not simply snow. It collapsed. The slate-gray ceiling of the world fractured, dumping heavy, wet flakes that swallowed the jagged landscape in a suffocating white silence. By the time the first true blizzard of the season hit, they had already vanished into the deep, winding fissures of a high country canyon. Their shelter was a deep alcove carved by ancient rushing rivers, tucked beneath a massive jutting overhang of red sandstone. It was a fortress of rock, shielding them from the howling winds that tore through the invisible pines above. Here the world shrank. It became nothing more than the span of a fire pit, a carefully guarded stack of cured wood, and the steady rhythmic breathing of the dun gelding tethered in the deep shadows. Winter demanded an entirely different kind of survival. The relentless, grueling forward motion of the trail was replaced by the tight circular orbit of the camp. They fell into a rhythm, a synchronized quiet dance of daily labor that required no words and tolerated no idleness. The cold was a constant prowling wolf at the edge of the firelight, held at bay only by their shared unbroken effort. Evelyn's hands, once soft and pale, accustomed to the delicate drag of a needle through embroidery, silk transformed. The blisters brought by the first weeks of the trail broke, bled, and eventually hardened into thick, unyielding calluses. She learned the heavy bruising work of grinding dried mesquite pods on a flat slab of granite. Scrape, grind, sweep. The sound became the heartbeat of the canyon. Scrape, grind, sweep. She knelt by the fire for hours, her shoulders aching the heavy buckskin dress, protecting her knees from the frozen earth. The fine dust of the mesquite coated her forearms, carrying a dark, nutty sweetness that mingled with the sharp tang of wood smoke, constantly stinging her eyes. She learned to turn the tough pods into a coarse, heavy flour, baking it on flat stones near the coals, a vital, sustaining energy that would keep the cold from eating them from the inside out. He was a ghost in the snow. He would leave before the dawn, a silent shadow slipping out into the blinding white drift to check deep-set snares or track whatever lean, desperate game had not already fled the high country. When he returned hours later, his dark hair dusted with frost and his blanket smelling of frozen pine pitch, he brought meat-heavy fuel and the silent, unspoken reassurance that they would live to see another morning. They built a complex language of movement. When he dropped a heavy snow-crusted bundle of deadwood at the edge of the alcove, she was already turning from the fire, stepping forward with a steaming tin cup of bitter pine needle tea. He would take it with a single sharp nod, the steam rising to obscure his dark eyes. When she struggled to strip the frozen stubborn bark from a branch to feed the flames, his long hunting knife would suddenly appear beside her, his large, capable hands taking over the task with effortless precision. There were no polite apologies. There were no grand expressions of gratitude. The frontier stripped away the fat of conversation, leaving only the lean, beautiful muscle of necessity. One evening, as the wind screamed a high, tearing pitch outside their stone sanctuary, they sat on opposite sides of the flames. The fire popped, spitting a sudden shower of orange sparks into the dark. Evelyn was working a bone needle, pulling a tough thread of animal sinew through a tear in the knee of her moccasin. Her fingers were stiff, the work slow and deeply frustrating in the flickering light. The Apache watched her. He sat cross-legged, a block of cedar in his lap, his knife shaving off long, curling ribbons of wood. He did not watch her with pity, nor with the assessing gaze of a captor. He watched her with the quiet, profound respect of one survivor recognizing another. He set his carving aside. He reached across the fire, his palm open. Evelyn paused. She looked at his hands, scarred and powerful, illuminated by the gold of the firelight. Then slowly she handed him the heavy hide moccasin and the bone needle. He did not take over because she was weak. He took over because her hands were freezing and his were closer to the heat. He pushed the needle through the thick leather with a smooth, practiced force, drawing the sinew tight. He bound the torn edges together, making it whole, making it strong against the bitter world outside. When he finished, he handed the boot back. Their fingers brushed. His skin was rough, radiating a deep furnace-like heat. Evelyn took the leather, feeling the sturdy, perfect stitches under her thumb. "It will hold," he said. His voice was a low rumble, blending perfectly with the crackle of the burning cedar. "I know," she replied softly. She slipped the warm leather back over her foot. The silence returned thick and absolute. Outside, the winter raged, burying the world in ice. But inside the alcove, wrapped in the smoke and the smell of cedar, they were an island of warmth, bound by the quiet, unbreakable rhythm of the winter camp. The mountain did not conquer with a sudden avalanche. It conquered through the slow, insidious theft of warmth. It happened late in the deep freeze of January. He returned from the tree line just as the light began to fail, dragging the gutted carcass of a lean winter hare. Normally his stride was unbroken, a masterclass in quiet balance against the slick ice. Tonight his boots dragged heavily through the drifts. He let the hair slip from his fingers a dozen yards from camp, stumbling forward until his hand caught the rough sandstone wall of their alcove. Evelyn stopped grinding the mesquite. The quiet rhythm of the camp shattered in an instant. He stood leaning against the rock, his head bowed, his broad chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow gasps. The cold air normally plumed around him in steady white clouds. Now it came in harsh, broken bursts. He pushed himself off the stone and took 2 steps toward the fire before his knees buckled beneath him. He simply folded into the dirt, a mountain collapsing inward. Evelyn was beside him before the fine white ash of the fire pit could settle. She dropped to her knees, her hands reaching for his shoulders. Through the thick wool of his blanket, he radiated a terrifying, unnatural heat. The winter fever had seized him with the sudden, violent grip of a wildfire in dry timber. She rolled him onto his back. His eyes were half closed, the dark obsidian depths, clouded and entirely unfocused. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air of the canyon. He muttered something in his own tongue, the words thick, rough, and disjointed. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in the back of Evelyn's throat. For months, he had been the immovable anchor. He was the fire bringer, the hunter, the silent guardian of their fragile existence. Now the roles were violently reversed. If he died here in the ice, she would follow him into the frozen earth within days. But the frontier had burned away the frightened Eastern woman in the sodden silk dress. What remained was a woman forged in wood smoke, heavy leather, and bitter survival. She did not weep. She did not hesitate. She moved. She dragged him closer to the fire pit, gritting her teeth against his dead weight, her muscles burning with the sudden desperate effort. She unrolled his heavy sleeping furs and wrestled him into them, tucking the thick hide edges tight against his neck to trap whatever heat his body was producing. Then she turned to the fire. It was dying down to a fragile bed of orange embers. If the fire died, they both died. She grabbed the heavy iron axe, her hands finding the familiar worn grooves of the wooden handle. She swung it against a frozen log of juniper, the shock of the impact rattling hard up her arms. She split the wood, feeding the hungry flames until they roared high, pushing back the encroaching shadows. Next was water. She took the blackened tin pot, scooped clean snow from the edge of the alcove, and set it directly on the red coals to melt. She searched his leather pouches, her fingers finding the dried leaves of the bitter willow bark he had once used for her own blistered feet. She crushed the bark, steeping it in the boiling water until it turned the color of dark earth. The night stretched into a black, endless eternity. The wind screamed through the canyon walls, a chorus of angry voices trying to tear their shelter apart. Evelyn sat beside him, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his sharp features. She took a scrap of clean linen, dipped it in the melted snow, and pressed it to his burning forehead. The heat hissed against the damp cloth. "Drink," she commanded softly, her voice carrying the same flat, pragmatic tone he had used on her months ago. She lifted his head, pressing the rim of the tin cup to his cracked lips. "You must drink." He swallowed blindly, choking slightly on the bitter tea. His large, calloused hand lashed out in the delirium, gripping her wrist with bruising, desperate force. He was fighting a phantom enemy in his mind, his muscles tense and straining against the furs. Evelyn did not pull away. She leaned closer, placing her free hand flat against the center of his chest, feeling the frantic, galloping rhythm of his heart through the hide shirt. "I am here," she whispered the words steady and low, cutting through his fevered haze. "I am holding the fire. Rest." Slowly the deep tension drained from his jaw. His grip on her wrist loosened, though he did not let go. His thumb rested against her racing pulse, a quiet, grounding anchor in the brutal storm. She stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, keeping the cold at bay hour after hour. She fed the fire. She bathed his face. She breathed for him when he could not. By the time the gray light of dawn finally crept over the canyon rim, the unnatural flush had faded from his skin. His breathing had deepened, settling into a steady, exhausted rhythm. Evelyn slumped against the sandstone wall, her hands covered in soot, and her body completely spent. She watched his chest rise and fall, the profound realization washing over her that she had not just kept him alive, she had fought the mountain for him, and she had won. The thaw did not arrive with a gentle warmth, but with the sharp, rhythmic sound of water. It started as a slow drip from the sandstone overhang, a singular note in the deep silence of the canyon. Within a week, the drip had become a steady rushing stream, carving through the remaining banks of gray snow. The air shifted. The biting, sterile smell of ice gave way to the rich, heavy scent of damp earth, bruised pine needles, and the faint, sweet promise of green shoots pushing through the mud. Spring had come to the high country. The Apache was fully healed, the winter fever, nothing more than a ghost in the shadows of their shared memory. He moved with his usual liquid grace, tightening the cinch on the dun gelding. The camp, their sanctuary for the brutal months of the freeze, was being systematically erased. The flat stones used for grinding mesquite were leaned against the canyon wall. The fire pit was buried under a thick layer of wet sand. Evelyn stood watching him. She wore the buckskin dress new molded perfectly to the shape of her body, stained with ash smoke and the hard labor of survival. Her hair, once pinned in elaborate, fragile styles, hung in a thick, simple braid down her back. She did not feel like a lady of the East anymore. The woman in the heavy sodden silk had died in the muddy arroyo months ago. In her place stood someone forged in iron and wood smoke. He finished with the saddlebags and turned to face her. The wind caught his dark hair, blowing it across his weathered features. The trail was open now. The mountain passes were clear. The journey back to the sprawling settlements and the iron rails of civilization would be long, but it was no longer impossible. He pointed a long, calloused finger toward the east, where the canyon opened up to the rolling plains. "The snow is gone," he said. His voice was the familiar low rumble carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. "The wagons will be moving again. You can find your people." He dropped his hand. He did not ask her to stay. He did not offer declarations of devotion or promises of a softer life. He simply laid the reality of the frontier at her feet, offering her the one thing the winter had stripped away: a choice. Evelyn looked out toward the east. She thought of the parlor rooms, the suffocating layers of corsets and expectations, the polite empty conversations over fragile china teacups. Then she looked back at the man standing beside the horse. She saw the scars on his hands, the steady, unwavering black of his eyes, and the quiet, immovable strength that had carried them both through the dark. She walked toward him. She did not look at the eastern horizon again. Instead, she reached out and took the heavy leather reins of the dun gelding from his hand. Their fingers brushed rough and calloused against rough and calloused. There was no hesitation in her movement. "My people are not in the east," Evelyn said softly. Her voice held no tremor. It was as clear and steady as the melting ice water dripping from the rocks. The Apache looked at her for a long, silent moment. The stoic mask did not break, but the harsh lines around his eyes softened by a fraction. A profound, wordless understanding passed between them, heavier and more permanent than any vow spoken in a church. He gave a single short nod. He turned his face toward the deep, rugged spine of the western mountains, and together they began to walk. He had told her in the freezing mud of their first night that it was not about love. He had been right. It was about surviving. But in the crucible of the winter, survival had slowly, quietly hardened into something unbreakable. As the echoes of their footsteps fade into the vast awakening landscape, we are left to ponder the silent paths we choose when the world strips us down to our core. Would you have returned to the familiar safety of the world you knew, or walked into the unknown, alongside the one who kept your fire alive? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Evelyn's choice, and let the quiet echoes of the West carry your voice.